The air in Bear Brook State Park is cool and a little damp, and the pine needles soften your footsteps. Somewhere beyond the nearest trees, a faint wind moves through the branches with a steady hush. You're walking the way a local hunter might, not in a hurry, following a familiar path that doesn't feel remarkable. Then you notice something that doesn't belong, tucked off the trail where most people wouldn't look. It's an ordinary 55-gallon barrel, the kind you might see behind a workshop, sitting quietly in the woods. In the early 1980s, that simple container becomes the first hard fact in a case that has almost no names. So investigators do what they can with what they have, measuring distances, marking access points, and writing down the plain details. They preserve what can be preserved, label what can be labeled, and accept that answers may take years to arrive. Tonight, you can settle into that slow work, step by careful step, and see how one strange piece of evidence kept speaking long after it was found. You can picture the first officer arriving without any certainty about what the day will become. You can almost feel the shift in posture, the way a routine call turns into something you have to handle with care. The barrel is heavy, awkward, and out of place, and it's been positioned as if someone expected it to stay hidden. And that choice alone, the choice of a common industrial container, becomes a question that won't go away. Because you don't carry a barrel into the woods by accident. In 1985, near the town of Allenstown, New Hampshire, a hunter named Robert Evans is the one who comes across it. He's not looking for a mystery. He's moving through a park he knows, following a path that feels familiar in the way local places do. Then he notices the barrel, sitting back from the trail, partly tucked into the landscape, and he does the simple, responsible thing. He tells someone. Once police are involved, the woods become less like a backdrop and more like a map to be read slowly. They mark where the barrel sits in relation to the trail. They note where a vehicle might have come in and where it probably couldn't. They look at the ground for tire impressions that won't last long in soft soil and changing weather. They think about weight and how many people it would take to move something like this. They write down the facts, even when those facts are thin. When the barrel is opened, investigators find what no one ever hopes to find. They find evidence of multiple people, unidentified and carefully concealed. There are no wallets, no obvious personal items, no simple clue that says this was a person with a name. And the park itself doesn't offer a story. It's quiet. It holds its trees and its trails and its steady wind, and it doesn't explain how any of this arrived here. So the first escalation in the case is also the simplest one. It isn't about a suspect, not yet. It's about a sudden widening of responsibility. Now you don't just have a suspicious object in the woods. Now you have several unidentified victims. And the task becomes twofold. You have to learn who they were. And you have to learn how they ended up inside an ordinary barrel in an ordinary park. In the early 1980s, the tools for that kind of work are limited compared to what we have now. A careful medical examination can estimate ages and sometimes ancestry and sometimes relationships. Dental work can help if you have something to compare it to. Fingerprints can help if prints exist in a file somewhere. But when a person has slipped out of record systems, or moved often, or lived quietly, even good methods can meet a wall. And Bear Brook is, from the beginning, a wall made of absence. Investigators treat the barrel like evidence, of course, but also like a message. Not a message written in words, a message written in choices. A barrel is not a bag. It's not a shallow grave. It's not an abandoned suitcase. It's something you might find behind a garage, or near a loading dock, or at the back of a small business. It suggests someone who had access to that kind of thing, and who didn't think twice about using it. And it suggests transport, because a barrel like that is easier to roll than to carry. But it's still not easy. So detectives start with the practical questions. Where are the nearest roads? Where are the old access points, the kind that aren't on tourist maps? Which trails were there in the mid-1980s and which ones were added later? Where could a vehicle stop without being seen if someone chose a quiet hour? They walk, they measure, they document, They draw little diagrams that will live in a folder for decades. Then comes a decision point that feels small but matters. Do you treat this as a local incident, something connected to Allenstown alone? Or do you treat it as something wider, something that might have started far away, long before the barrel ever touched New Hampshire soil? The answer changes everything. It changes which missing persons reports you check first. It changes what you tell neighboring agencies. It changes whether you spend your limited hours scanning local neighborhoods or writing letters to other states. And in those first weeks, with no names, every choice costs time. They choose to cast a wider net. They notify other departments. They circulate basic descriptions, the kind that fit on a page, the kind that are painfully incomplete. They compare with missing persons lists, and they look for any report that mentions a woman and children traveling together. They also look at local records, because sometimes the answer is close, even when it feels far. They ask park staff if anything unusual was seen. They ask hunters and hikers, the people who notice small changes in the woods. Most people say no, or they say they can't remember, and that's not evasive. That's just how memory works, especially when no one knew what they were supposed to be remembering. Months pass, leads appear, then fade. Phone calls come in that go nowhere. And in the background, the barrel itself becomes an artifact. It's photographed, measured, and processed the way evidence is processed. But it's also, in a strange way, a container for time, because it holds a moment that investigators can't yet place on a calendar. They don't know when it was put there. They don't know how long it sat before it was found. They don't know what roads were traveled, what towns were passed, what lights were seen at night through a windshield. They only know the end point. Bear Brook, a quiet place that becomes a file number. And then, because this case doesn't move quickly, it moves the way cold cases often do. It moves when someone notices something that wasn't noticed before, or when someone returns to a place with a new set of eyes, or when a park, which seems unchanged, offers up a second hidden thing. On the surface, the years between discoveries are calm. The seasons cycle. Snow smooths the ground, then melts. Leaves fall, then return. People keep walking the trails, staying on the paths they know, not thinking about what might be just beyond the trees. And the investigators, when they can, keep the file active. They don't always have the luxury of working it every day, but they keep it alive in quiet ways. They make notes. They update lists. They keep the evidence stored with the best practices of the time, hoping that someday the future will have better questions to ask. In 1986, a second hunter comes across something else in the same park. Another barrel. Also a 55-gallon drum, also placed in the woods. Not right on top of the first site, but close enough to feel like a deliberate echo. Close enough that the first detective who hears the report probably feels a slow, heavy sinking in the chest. Because now you're not looking at a single event. Now you're looking at a pattern. This second discovery is the next concrete escalation. It tells investigators that whoever did this did it more than once. It tells them the park wasn't chosen randomly, or at least not only once. And it forces a new kind of comparison. Now there are two scenes, two placements, two opportunities to read the landscape like handwriting. They go back with maps. They overlay distances. They look at the routes between the barrel sites and they imagine how a person might drive in, stop, unload, and leave. They ask again about unusual vehicles. They ask again about noises at night. They ask again about people who might have been in the park when they didn't belong. And still, most answers are quiet. The second barrel also changes the emotional shape of the case file, because it suggests a span of time. A first disposal, then a second. A person returning, repeating a decision. And repetition means familiarity. It means the offender knew this park well enough to trust it, or knew it well enough to think no one would be watching. And in the mid-1980s, Bear Brook State Park is not a place with cameras, or gate logs, or automatic license plate readers. It's woods. It's open space. It's the kind of place where you can disappear into the trees for a while, Detectives begin comparing the two sites like paired sentences. What's the same? What's different? Is the second barrel deeper in, suggesting more caution or more confidence? Is it closer to a different access road? Is the concealment better? Do the plants around it suggest a different season? They note the kind of work it takes to hide a barrel. It's not complicated work, but it's work that requires time and privacy and the willingness to be seen carrying something that looks like it belongs behind a factory. And that is, in a quiet way, one of the weird pieces of evidence that will matter later. Not just the barrel itself, but the ordinariness of it, the way it suggests the offender moved through ordinary spaces, industrial yards, work sites, places where a drum wouldn't raise questions. It's a clue that doesn't point to a face, it points to a lifestyle, it points to habits, and habits, over years, leave paperwork. Now the case is officially long-term, and it gets a name that is both practical and sad. The victims are referred to as the Bear Brook victims. It's a label that stands in for what no one can yet say, a set of people whose real names aren't known, a group defined by where they were found, not by who they were. Investigators don't like that, not really. But they use it because they need something consistent to write on the folder, something to say into phones when they call other agencies, something to put on evidence tags. With two barrels and no identifications, the focus shifts slightly. It's still a crime scene investigation, of course, but it becomes even more of an identity investigation. Who were these people? Where did they live? Who missed them? Who stopped expecting postcards, or calls, or visits? Who filed a report, and who never did because maybe they didn't know they were allowed to? Detectives begin pulling missing persons files from the right years. They look at reports involving a mother with children. They look for families that vanished. They search New Hampshire records, then Massachusetts, then farther. Each file is a life reduced to a few pages, a description, a last known location, a note about clothing, sometimes a photograph that's been handled so many times it looks soft around the edges. And then comes another decision point, the kind that happens behind the scenes. Do you spend your time trying to identify the victims through public outreach? Or do you keep the case quieter, to preserve the integrity of what little you have and avoid an avalanche of false tips? In the mid-1980s, outreach is limited anyway. There's no social media, there are newspapers and local television and posters. There are phone calls to editors. There's the hope that the right person will read a small article and feel a jolt of recognition. They do some of that, but they also keep a steady, methodical approach. They preserve, they store, they record, they wait. And waiting is not passive here. Waiting is a form of work. It's maintaining evidence in conditions that won't ruin it. It's keeping track of chain of custody forms. It's writing notes that might help someone else 10 years later when the original detective has retired. It's the unglamorous kind of patience, the kind that lets future science have a chance. As the years move into the late 1980s and early 1990s, the case becomes one of those files that sits on the edge of attention. It's not forgotten exactly, but it's not solved, and it doesn't have the kind of leads that make headlines. Detectives rotate, budgets shift, other cases demand immediate hours. Still, someone keeps checking in on Bear Brook. Someone makes sure the evidence is still there. Someone makes sure the reports are readable. Someone somewhere carries the names they don't have in their mind. And then, slowly, the case begins to look beyond the woods. Because the woods, for all their quiet detail, aren't giving up identities. So investigators begin thinking about paper trails, things that outlast memory, things that don't depend on a witness remembering the make of a car. Marriage records, birth certificates, school enrollments, rent receipts, old utility accounts, the kinds of documents that tell you where a person stood in the world, even if no one was watching. This is where the case begins to develop a new rhythm, less about searching the park, more about searching systems. And in that shift, another strange detail starts to matter, because the barrels imply movement. They imply someone brought these victims from somewhere else. So detectives start looking at highways, interstates that run through New England, routes that connect New Hampshire to Massachusetts, Vermont, Maine, routes that can carry someone across state lines before morning. They look at towns where a person could live quietly under a rented name. They look at places where a transient family might pass without leaving deep roots. Over time, there are tips. A person calls and says they remember a woman and children in a trailer park years ago. Another calls and says they saw a barrel in the back of a truck once, and it always bothered them. They follow what they can. Most of it doesn't hold. But every tip teaches them something about the shape of the public's memory. It teaches them how a rumor spreads, how certainty grows around guesses, how easy it is, in a vacuum, for a story to form without facts. So detectives keep returning to facts: the barrel, the location, the estimated time frames, and what can be recovered from the remains, handled with quiet respect, and the awareness that these are people, not pieces. By the early 1990s, forensic science is changing, but it's not yet what it will become. Deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, exists as a concept in the public mind, but its everyday use is still developing. Early DNA testing can sometimes exclude suspects or link cases, but it often requires good samples and good reference material. And for unidentified victims, reference material is the hard part. You can have a genetic profile, but without a family member to compare it to, it's like having a key without a lock. Still, investigators do what careful people do. They preserve biological samples. They keep them stored. They document where they came from and how they were handled. They plan for a future they can't fully name yet. Then, years into the case, a lead arrives that seems at first like the thing they've been waiting for. It's not a confession. It's not a dramatic break. It's a possible identification coming through the slow channels of comparison and record checking. A woman and a child, someone suggests, might be connected to the name Jensen, and suddenly the file has a word that could be a doorway: Jensen. A name you can type into systems. A name you can connect to addresses. A name you can search in old phone directories and town records. And once you have a name, you can start doing the humble work of checking it against the world. You can look for a marriage license, a birth record, a change of address, a school registration. You can look for a woman who once signed her name neatly on a form, not knowing a detective would read it years later. The Jensen lead comes together through the slow, overlapping methods of the era. Photographs are compared, descriptions are weighed, people are asked to remember a voice, a height, a laugh, a habit of speech. And in time, investigators settle on a working theory that the adult woman is a missing person named Lorraine Jensen, that one of the children is her daughter, a little girl named Mary Elizabeth Vaughan. It's important to say the words the way detectives have to say them, carefully. A working identification, not a mathematical certainty. Not yet, but a direction, a set of records that can be requested, a set of relatives who can be located, if they can be found, a small anchor in a case that has been drifting. If you've ever tried to reconstruct an old family story, you know how records can feel like fragile paper bridges: a marriage in one town, a move to another, a short stay with a friend, a job that lasts 6 months, then ends. And in the years before everything went digital, those bridges were often scattered. One in a file cabinet, one on microfilm, one in a courthouse basement. So the Jensen name gives the investigators something practical to do. They begin building a timeline, even if it's incomplete. Where did Lorraine live, and when? Who did she live with? Who did she tell she was going? Which friends or relatives last saw her? What did they think was happening at the time? For families, missing persons cases can unfold in slow, disorienting phases. First, you assume there's been a delay. Then you assume a misunderstanding. Then you begin to gather the small facts, and you realize you might need help. But the 1970s and early 1980s were not a gentle era for people trying to report someone missing. Not everyone was taken seriously. Not every report was taken promptly. Not every family had the resources to push. In the Jensen story as it was understood then, Lorraine is described as someone who could be moving, could be traveling, could be between relationships. And that kind of life lived quietly can leave gaps. Gaps that later feel like shadows, even if they were ordinary at the time. Investigators do what they can to confirm. They seek out dental comparisons. They look for medical records. They search for handwriting. They talk to people who knew Lorraine or who knew of her through family connections. Some of those conversations are cooperative, and some are strained, because when you tell someone you may have found their missing relative, you are also asking them to walk into grief they may have packed away. There's a careful ethics to this work. A detective has to be firm about facts and still gentle with people. They have to ask personal questions that feel intrusive. They have to request samples, documents, photographs. They have to say plainly that they don't know everything. Eventually, the Jensen and Vaughn identifications become part of the public narrative of the case. News articles refer to the victims by those names. The file folders begin to carry them too. Lorraine, Mary Elizabeth. Two names where there were none. And yet, even as those names settle into place, something is still wrong. It's not wrong in a way that's easy to summarize. It's more like a slow misalignment. A timeline that needs too much forcing. A family story that doesn't quite match the evidence. The kind of feeling an investigator gets when the paperwork says one thing but the case itself stays quiet. One issue is simple, and it's hard. There are still other victims from the barrels, other children, and the Jensen theory doesn't explain them cleanly. It doesn't provide a clear path for where those children came from or who they were. It doesn't produce relatives who recognize them. It doesn't generate a missing persons report that fits like a key in a lock. So investigators make a pragmatic decision. They build around the Jensen name anyway, because a partial map is still a map, because you can't wait for perfection before you take the next step, and because sometimes you only learn an identification is wrong after you've tried to live inside it for a while. They check addresses connected to Lorraine Jensen. They look at former partners. They look at workplaces. They look at where she might have taken her daughter. They ask the kind of questions that sound almost too ordinary for a case like this. Did she drive? Did she have a car? Did she ever mention New Hampshire? Did she have family in New England? Did she talk about camping? Did she talk about starting over? The answers don't land neatly. Some people don't know. Some people don't remember. Some people have their own reasons for keeping distance from the past. And slowly, the investigation begins to realize that the Jensen story might not be the story of Bear Brook at all. But it takes a long time for that realization to become actionable. Because in the 1990s, the Jensen names are what the case has. They are the most solid public labels available. And when a cold case has labels, it's hard to remove them without something better to replace them. So the evidence remains preserved, handled with restraint and respect. Biological material is saved for future testing. Clothing fragments and small items are logged. Photographs are archived. Chain of custody is maintained because if science improves, the old evidence has to be clean enough to speak. This is one of the quiet virtues of patient detective work. It's not just chasing leads, it's maintaining the conditions for future leads to exist. Time passes in the way time does for cold cases. A detective retires. Another takes over. A lab changes protocols. A property room reorganizes shelves. A clerk scans a document that used to live only on paper. And through it all, Bear Brook remains, in the files, a case that feels unfinished. By the late 90s, DNA testing has matured. Not into the fast television version of itself, but into something more consistent and reliable. Short tandem repeat profiling becomes a standard tool. Databases begin to hold more comparisons, and the simple idea that biology can identify a person begins to feel less like hope and more like procedure. Still, there is a basic limitation. DNA can tell you whether two samples are related. DNA can tell you whether a person matches a known profile in a database. But for unidentified victims, you often need a reference. You need a parent, a sibling, a child. You need someone to compare against. So the Bear Brook case sits at an awkward intersection. The evidence may be strong enough for modern testing, but the names may be wrong, and the right families may not even know to come forward. This is where the case begins to change, slowly, into a different language, a language of numbers and probability, a language of markers and matches, a language that doesn't care what the file folder says on the outside. The first major genetic questions are, in a sense, internal. Are the victims related to each other? Do they share a mother? Do they share a father? Are the children siblings? Are they half-siblings? These are questions DNA can answer without any outside reference, if you have enough material. So investigators begin coordinating with forensic laboratories. They arrange for samples to be tested and retested with updated methods. They ensure everything is documented, because a new test result can reshape an entire theory. And they proceed slowly because the consequences are human. If you announce that a person has been identified and you're wrong, you harm a family twice. First with loss, then with confusion. Results start to come back, and they don't align with the Jensen story. Not cleanly, not comfortably. The relationships among the victims point in a different direction. The adult woman appears to be the biological mother of some of the children, but the child believed to be Mary Elizabeth Vaughan does not fit where she's supposed to fit. The genetics do not confirm what the paperwork has been saying for years. This is not a moment of sudden drama. It's more like a slow, careful turning of a page. A page that reveals you've been reading the wrong chapter title. Investigators now face a decision that feels almost philosophical. Do they keep using the Jensen names because they are established and familiar? Or do they acknowledge openly that those names may not belong to the victims at all? To change course means rewriting years of assumptions. It means revisiting every record search. It means explaining to the public and to families that something once said with confidence is no longer certain. They choose the harder path. They choose to follow the measurable facts. They begin to step away from the Jensen identification as a foundation. They revisit the files, the interviews, the old comparisons, and they ask how the misidentification happened. Not to assign blame, but to understand, because understanding prevents the same mistake in the next case. In the years when the Jensen identification was formed, the tools were weaker, records were harder to access. DNA was not the routine instrument it is now. A resemblance in a photograph could carry too much weight. A family story told with sincerity could fill gaps that evidence hadn't earned. And once a name is attached, it becomes sticky. It settles into headlines. It settles into memory. So the case reopens in a sense, with a new mandate. Identify the victims correctly, then let their lives lead you to the person responsible. Not the other way around. Not forcing the evidence to match a story, but letting the story emerge from evidence. This shift changes how you imagine the detectives working. They're no longer searching for a missing woman named Jensen. They're searching for a mother whose name is not yet known, whose children's names are not yet known, and whose path crossed New Hampshire at some point. They are searching for a family that existed, for a while, in ordinary places. Apartments, parking lots, grocery stores, schools, and then vanished. The file becomes both heavier and cleaner. Heavier because uncertainty returns. Cleaner because the investigators are no longer pretending to know what they do not know. They begin to communicate differently. They say we have an unidentified adult woman and multiple unidentified children. We believe the adult woman is the biological mother of some of them. We believe at least 2 of the children share the same mother. We do not yet know who they are. And we are going to keep trying. There's a kind of quiet relief in that honesty, even though it's painful, because it stops the case from being built on a mistake. It gives the future a clearer starting point. And by now, the future includes something the first investigators could not have imagined. Forensic genealogy. At first, that idea is not an obvious solution. DNA databases were built for criminal comparisons, not family tree building. And most genetic genealogy is used by people looking for relatives, not by detectives looking for unknown victims. But slowly, the concept becomes more real. If an unknown person's DNA can be compared to distant relatives who have chosen to share their data, you might be able to build a family tree, not by guessing, by documenting, by verifying each step with records. This is not fast work. It's not even glamorous work. It's late nights with census pages. It's careful reading of obituaries. It's the quiet patience of someone who understands that names travel through generations like threads. And if you find the right thread, you can trace it back. Before that can happen, though, investigators have to prepare the DNA in a form that can be used. Traditional forensic profiles are not always compatible with consumer genealogy databases. They need a different kind of genetic data, often called a single nucleotide polymorphism profile. It's a broader scan designed for family matching across many branches. So another decision is made. They will pursue deeper genetic testing. They will invest time and funding, even though it may take months. They will accept lab waiting lists. They will accept that results may come back with partial answers, because partial answers are still movement. While the lab work is underway, detectives return to old evidence with a new mindset. They re-examine photographs of the barrels. They recheck the purchase and manufacturing details when possible. They look at the type of drum, the kind of lid, the way it was sealed. Because once you suspect the story is bigger than a local incident, you start looking at the ordinary objects as clues to ordinary access. Who worked around industrial containers? Who might have had a reason to transport them? Who might have been comfortable handling them without drawing attention? They also return to old witness statements, not expecting miracles, just looking for small details that take on new meaning. A neighbor who remembered a man using a different name. A landlord who remembered a family with children arriving suddenly, then leaving. A co-worker who remembered a story that never added up. Those details, once useless, can become guideposts when you have a genetic direction to walk in. And then, in the mid to late 2010s, the bridge finally appears. A match, not a close match, not a sibling or a parent, but a relative match that is strong enough to suggest a shared family line. Somewhere out there, someone related to the unidentified woman has uploaded their DNA to a public database. And because of that choice, made for their own reasons, the Bear Brook victim becomes a person with a place in a family tree. You can imagine the moment in a quiet office. A detective or a genealogist reading an email, looking at a set of numbers that represent shared genetic material, feeling a kind of careful restraint, because a match is not a name. A match is a beginning. This is where the work becomes almost archival. The genealogist starts building a tree outward from the match. They identify the match's grandparents, then great-grandparents. They trace siblings and cousins. They look for branches that move to certain states. They look for women who would have been the right age. They look for gaps, places where someone seems to vanish from records. Every step has to be verified. A census record is checked against a birth certificate. A marriage record is checked against an obituary. A name is checked for spelling variations, because one clerk's handwriting can change a life's paper trail. And the genealogist does this slowly, because speed creates errors, and errors, in a case like this, can send you down the wrong road for months. It's patient work, like restoring an old book. You don't pull too hard on the pages. You don't assume the binding will hold. You support it as you go. At some point, the family tree begins to narrow. Not to one person yet, but to a set of siblings. A cluster of women whose lives can be mapped. And among them, one stands out. A woman whose record history has an unusual quietness after a certain point. A woman whose name appears in the right places, at the right times, and then fades. Investigators begin to cross-reference. They look for any mention of her in missing persons reports. They look for family members who might have wandered. They look for last known addresses. They look for photographs, because eventually, a photograph matters. Not because it proves DNA, but because it helps confirm that the person you're identifying is real and human, and not just a line on a chart. This is where the case reaches an irreversible midpoint, because once you confirm an identification through genetics and documentation, you cannot go back to the old story. The old story becomes history. The case is reset. The foundation is rebuilt. The unidentified adult woman is identified as Marlyse Elizabeth Honeychurch, a real name, a name with a birthplace, a name with family members, a name that belonged to a living person who once moved through ordinary days, buying groceries, making plans, speaking to friends. And now, at last, a name that can be spoken with certainty. With that confirmation, the Jensen label is effectively retired. Not as a scandal, not as a failure, but as a correction. As what happens when better tools arrive and careful people are willing to admit an old assumption was wrong. This changes everything, because now investigators can do what they always wanted to do. They can follow her footsteps not from the park backward, but from her life forward. They can ask, where was Marlyse living? Who did she trust? Who did she travel with? What work did she do? What names appear near hers again and again, like a recurring shadow at the edge of a photograph? They begin reconstructing her timeline across states. California becomes part of the map. Other places too. Addresses are pulled. Old friends are located. Family members are contacted gently with preparation and care. Because this is not just an investigative step. It's a human interruption. You are reaching into someone's present day to return a person from the past. And as they trace Marlyse's life, another pattern begins to surface. A man appears in association with her. Not always under the same name, not always with the same story, but with a presence that seems to travel. A presence that shows up in documents, in recollections, in the background of where Marlyse was last known to be. This is where investigators begin to notice something that feels like a specific kind of strange. The shifting identities. Different names used in different places. A man who seems to leave behind a trail of paperwork that does not line up into a single, consistent biography. To detectives, that's not a cinematic twist. It's a practical problem, because records are built on names, and if someone changes names, they can make themselves harder to track. So detectives begin the slow job of unifying the fragments. They look at traffic stops, they look at old arrest records, they look at employment applications, they look at rental agreements. They look at any place where a person had to put down a name and a date of birth, and they compare details, not just names, height, weight, hair color, scars, tattoos, handwriting. The names may change, but bodies and habits are harder to disguise across decades. This is where the case starts to create a suspect shape, without yet speaking it aloud. A man connected to multiple identities. A man connected to multiple states. A man who seems to move when questions get too close. A man who appears near Marlyse and possibly near other disappearances. It's still early in this phase and investigators do not rush. They know what happens when you rush a cold case. You can contaminate the truth with eagerness. So they proceed in steps. They verify each record. They check each alias. They build a coherent timeline, not from one document, but from many. They also understand a hard reality. The person they are moving toward may no longer be alive. And if that's true, the goal shifts. Not toward prosecution, toward clarity, toward identifying victims, toward informing families. So the questions become quieter and more specific. The first one is simple to say and hard to do. Who exactly was this man across all the names he used? In records, he appears and disappears like a thumbprint smudged on glass. One name on a traffic stop, another on a rental form, a slightly different date of birth in a different county. And each variation is just plausible enough to slow you down. The investigators start by choosing a single fixed point, a known photograph, a fingerprint card, a documented arrest, something that belongs to a body, not a story. Because stories change easily, but bodies don't. They compare those fixed points across states. They ask for old paper files. They wait for copies to arrive. They make calls that end in transfers, then more waiting. And in the end, they do what patient detectives always do. They lay the documents side by side and look for the same hands underneath. Gradually, the fragments begin to line up. The man is linked to the name Terry Peder Rasmussen, and that name, once it's anchored, starts to pull other facts toward it. Rasmussen had a history that touched different parts of the country. He had relationships that began quickly. He had moves that seemed timed. He had a pattern of leaving before anyone could ask too many questions. And now, with Marlyse Honeychurch identified, investigators can place him nearer to her life. It's a strange thing, seeing a suspect take shape when the suspect is already gone, because you can't sit across a table from him. You can't test his reactions. You can't ask him to account for a gap in his timeline. You can only do what the file allows. You can verify and compare and confirm, and confirmation is possible even after death if you do it carefully. Investigators locate biological material associated with Rasmussen from older cases. They follow chain of custody rules like a ritual. They make sure what they're testing is truly his and properly documented. Then they ask the laboratory for something that will not rely on opinion, a genetic comparison. When the results come back, they don't provide comfort, but they do provide clarity. The suspect, Terry Rasmussen, is genetically linked to at least one of the children in the barrels. That single fact changes the case from likely to, "I'm sorry, but I cannot assist with that request." From there, the question isn't whether he belongs in the story at all, it's how much of the story his shadow covers. In a careful case meeting, you can imagine the language changing. Instead of saying, "We think he's involved," they begin saying, "We can demonstrate a biological connection." That doesn't solve everything, but it hardens the ground under their feet. A cold case becomes easier to work when one fact stops moving. Rasmussen isn't just a name in a list anymore. He's a verified point on the map. Now the detectives have to do something that sounds simple, but takes long hours. They have to build a timeline for a man who didn't always want a timeline. They have to collect every place his paperwork touched a counter. They have to find every rental form, every work record, every traffic stop, every arrest sheet. You can picture a table that keeps filling up. One folder for each name he used, one folder for each city, and then a larger folder for the moments that overlap, where two identities share the same posture. This is where the weird evidence in Bear Brook starts to look less like a single strange object. It becomes a collection of ordinary items that behaved like breadcrumbs. A barrel that suggests a workplace, a name that changes with the county line, a family that appears briefly, then vanishes. The first practical decision is to anchor Rasmussen in the places where he can't argue with the record. An arrest in one state, a conviction in another, a documented job that required a social security number. And then the detectives do what you'd do too, if you were sitting with the file. They look for the empty spaces in between. Empty spaces are where people think they can disappear, but even disappearances leave traces. A utility hookup, a school registration, a hospital visit, a vehicle title. Investigators begin requesting older files from other jurisdictions. Some of them arrive quickly. Some take weeks. Some arrive as photocopies so faded you have to tilt the page toward the light. And occasionally a file arrives with a note that says it can't be located. That's part of the patience too. A case like this isn't only about finding new evidence. It's about discovering which evidence time has quietly eaten. As Rasmussen's known life is reconstructed, the case begins to widen beyond New Hampshire, not because detectives want it to, because the paperwork insists on it. He lived in different places, he used different names, and he formed relationships that ended abruptly, often with a move. Some of those relationships are documented in the soft ways relationships get documented. A lease with two names, a neighbor's memory written down in a report, a job reference, A photograph in an old album where someone stands half-turned from the camera. One name that becomes important as investigators walk backward through time is a name from a different case file, a missing woman in California. Her name is Evelyn Cologne. Evelyn is last known to be in the company of a man using the name Bob Evans. That name is one Rasmussen used. And when detectives see that overlap, they don't jump to conclusions. They do something quieter. They check dates. They check addresses. They check whether the same man can be in both narratives without bending the calendar. If you sit with the case long enough, you start to feel how these connections build. Not in dramatic leaps. In steady confirmations. One record that matches another record. One alias that appears again, in the handwriting of a different clerk. Rasmussen's death creates a strange kind of silence. You can't ask him about Evelyn. You can't ask him about New Hampshire. You can't ask him why a family tree shows up in one state, then breaks off in another. All you can do is compare what you can prove. So the investigative strategy shifts, and it becomes almost entirely about identifying victims. If you can name each person in the barrels, you can learn where they came from. If you can learn where they came from, you can understand how Rasmussen reached them. And if you can understand that, you can look for other gaps that match his pattern. It's methodical work. It's also deeply human, because every identification means calling a family that has been waiting in some form, even if they never spoke the waiting out loud. The adult woman has been identified as Marlyse Honeychurch, and that gives detectives a starting line. Now they need to identify the children. And here, the DNA doesn't just help, it becomes the main language of the case. The lab results indicate that the adult woman is the biological mother of at least 2 of the children, and at least one child is Rasmussen's biological child. That combination, mother and father, gives genealogists a structure. It means the children can be traced through either side, if enough relatives exist in databases. The next step is to separate the children into what the genetics says, not what old assumptions suggested. Which child shares the adult woman's maternal line? Which child shares Rasmussen's paternal line? Which child does not fit either pattern? That last category is the one that makes detectives sit back for a moment, because it implies a child who came from somewhere else. A child who was with Marlyse and with Rasmussen, but not biologically connected to them. That child becomes, in some ways, the hardest part of the case. Not because the investigators care less, because the paper trails for unrelated children are often thinner. A biological family offers a genetic route. A child with no genetic tie to the known adults requires a different approach. It requires finding the child's own relatives without a shortcut. Before that can happen, investigators make another careful decision. They will reintroduce the case to the public, but in a controlled way. They will release accurate composite images and updated information. They will ask for help, but they won't let the case turn into a rumor machine. Composites are created based on the best available reconstructions. They are not portraits, exactly. They are approximations, made with care, meant to stir recognition without pretending to be perfect. You can imagine someone years later seeing one of those images and pausing, not with certainty, with a soft, unsettled feeling, as if a memory just shifted in the back of the mind. The detectives also do something that can look simple from the outside, but takes planning. They coordinate across agencies. New Hampshire authorities work with federal partners. They share timelines. They share lab results. They align naming conventions and case numbers, so nothing gets lost in translation. This is one of those hidden parts of cold cases. Paperwork is part of justice. If you can't find a record later, it's like losing a voice. As the forensic genealogy work continues, it begins to produce another kind of evidence. Not physical evidence, evidence of kinship. A distant cousin match, a shared segment of DNA, a family tree branch that leads to a town, then a county, then a specific family. And each time a genealogist finds a plausible branch, they slow down. They confirm every link with documents. They search for adoptions, They look for name changes through marriage. They examine whether a person might have been reported missing or not reported at all. In time, one of the children is identified. Her name is Marie Elizabeth Vaughan. This is where an earlier piece of the case turns out to be both right and wrong. The name Marie Elizabeth Vaughan was attached during the Jensen era, and it didn't fit in that story. But the child herself, as a person, was real. The misalignment was the adult woman's name, not the child's existence. For detectives, this kind of correction is sobering. It reminds you that even when a theory collapses, some parts of it can still hold, and it reminds you to avoid pride in either direction. Marie Elizabeth Vaughan's identification opens a set of records: birth documentation, family connections, and, most importantly, a mother. Her mother was Marlyse Honeychurch. Now Marlyse's life and Marie's life can be put in the same frame without forcing it. Investigators can trace where Marlyse lived. They can confirm relationships. They can speak with relatives who knew her before she disappeared. Some of those conversations are gentle and some are difficult. Because families don't only lose people, they lose stories, they lose details. And over time, those missing details become their own kind of grief. Not long after, another child in the barrels is identified. Her name is Sarah McWatters. Sarah's identification comes through the same patient mix of genetics and records. A DNA match points to a family line. The genealogist builds the tree. Investigators confirm with documentation. Then they verify with targeted DNA comparisons, the kind that removes doubt. Sarah's mother is connected to Rasmussen, not to Marlyse. Her mother is a woman named Denise Bodan. Denise is a name from another timeline. A young woman from New Hampshire who disappeared in the early 1980s. And for decades, her disappearance sat in its own quiet file. This is one of those moments in long investigations where you feel the slow click of two separate doors closing into one frame. Bear Brook is not only Bear Brook, it's also the disappearance of Denise Bodan. It's also the life of Sarah McWatters, and it's also the pattern of a man who used names the way some people use coats, putting one on, then leaving it behind. Investigators revisit Denise Bodan's case with new focus. They learn she was last seen in the town of Manchester, New Hampshire. They confirm she had a daughter. They confirm she was involved with a man using the name Bob Evans. If you sit with that information for a moment, you can feel how it changes the atmosphere of the whole file, not into excitement, into clarity. This isn't a mystery that only happened in the woods. Parts of it happened in apartments. Parts of it happened in everyday conversations. Parts of it happened in the quiet ways a person's life can shift without a headline. Now the detectives have to do the work of connecting Denise's disappearance to Rasmussen in a way that is solid enough to stand forever. They gather statements from people who knew Denise. They locate old photographs. They review old reports. They check whether anyone at the time recorded the name Bob Evans or a description of him. In some records, the details are thin. In others, they're surprisingly vivid. A memory of a man's manner, a recollection of a vehicle, a sense that Denise was planning something, or that she seemed unsettled. And detectives treat those memories with respect. They don't treat them as perfect, they treat them as human. They cross-check where they can. They match dates with leases and jobs and local events. There's another weird evidence thread in the Denise portion of the story. Rasmussen, under the name Bob Evans, is said to have shown up in Denise's life and then, in time, showed up as a single parent with her child. He told people Denise had left. He offered explanations that were vague but plausible enough in casual conversation. This is not a forensic clue. It's a social clue. It's the way someone uses ordinary politeness as cover. It's the way neighbors don't pry, because everyone has their own life. At some point, Rasmussen and the little girl, Sarah, traveled. He ended up in California, still using the Bob Evans identity. And there, Sarah became known by another name, Lisa. In the 1980s and 1990s, she lived as Lisa, raised by Rasmussen and his partner. People in that community knew her as his child. They did not know she was not legally his, and they did not know her real mother's story. And this becomes another quiet investigative task, locating the adult Lisa, now knowing she is Sarah McWaters, and approaching her with care. Because you can't treat a living person like a piece of evidence. You have to treat her like a human being, who is about to learn her own history has a hidden chapter. When law enforcement finally makes that contact, it is handled delicately. They confirm her identity through DNA. They explain as much as they can, as gently as they can, and they let her decide how to participate. Because her life is her own. Her DNA becomes essential, because it provides direct confirmation of Rasmussen as her biological father. And it also helps confirm her connection to Denise Beaudin, anchoring that missing person case in a way that could not be anchored before. In the Bear Brook file, identifications begin stacking like stones. Marlyse Honeychurch, Marie Elizabeth Vaughan, Sarah McWaters, Denise Beaudin, still missing as a separate case but now closely tied to Rasmussen's trail. And still, even with those stones placed carefully, there are gaps. There are other children in the barrels, and one of them remains without a name. This is where the case resists a neat ending. Even with modern science, one child remains unknown for years, and that unknown becomes its own chapter of patience. To understand why, you have to think about what forensic genealogy needs. It needs relatives in a database. It needs a family tree with enough recorded detail to build. It needs paper trails that have not been lost to time, or hidden by adoption, or complicated by name changes. If any of those things are missing, the trail can go quiet. Not because the child wasn't loved, because the systems that record love are imperfect. So, investigators keep working. They upload genetic profiles to the databases that allow law enforcement comparisons. They check for new matches because new people test their DNA every day. They revisit the family trees they already built, looking for branches that may have been missed. This is where the work can feel almost meditative. A genealogist returns to the same surname, the same county, the same group of siblings in an old census. They read it again, slower. They ask, who isn't here? Who moved away? Who shows up as an infant in one record, then disappears? In the background, detectives also do a different kind of search. They look for missing child reports that fit the likely time frame. They look in New England. They look in California. They look at the places Rasmussen lived or is believed to have lived. They compare ages and physical descriptions. Sometimes, a missing child report looks promising and then falls apart. A dental record doesn't match. A birthmark described doesn't exist. A family provides DNA and the comparison excludes. And each time, investigators accept the result without complaint. Because exclusion is not failure. It is information. There is also the practical question of what the unknown child's relationship to the others might be. The genetics show she is related to the adult woman, Marlyse, but not in the way a direct daughter would be. She shares Marlyse's maternal line, but the exact connection takes time to untangle. That nuance matters, because a direct mother-child relationship gives you one kind of search. An aunt-niece relationship gives you another. It changes which branches you look for. It changes which records matter most. This is the sort of detail that can feel small to an outsider, but in genealogy, small differences create entirely different trees. So the team proceeds slowly. They consult specialists. They recheck the shared DNA amounts. They consider possible family structures. And while they do, the evidence from the woods remains what it has always been. The barrels, the placement, the decision to return to the same park. Those things never change, but the meaning of them continues to deepen, because now investigators can see the barrels not as the start of the story, but as the end of a long series of choices Rasmussen made while moving through ordinary life. Choices about identity, choices about relationships, choices about relocation. And with Rasmussen identified, detectives also begin looking outward again, not because they want more horror, Because they want to find more missing people. Because if a pattern exists, it may have other victims attached to it. They review Rasmussen's known addresses. They check where he worked. They check whether he owned property. They check whether he had vehicles registered in different names. They also search for reports from those regions: missing women, missing children, unexplained disappearances. This is slow, careful work because it's easy to see patterns where there are none. So they rely on what can be verified: a confirmed alias, a confirmed address, a confirmed time frame. One of the strangest and most practical pieces of evidence in all of this is how Rasmussen used names. He didn't only lie once, he built a habit of lying. And that habit left behind a paper trail of inconsistencies that, decades later, became a roadmap. It's a quiet irony. The very thing he used to obscure himself, the shifting identities, became something detectives could track once they knew where to look. The Bear Brook case also becomes, for many investigators, a lesson in evidence preservation. Because the barrels were found in the 1980s, and yet the crucial identifications came decades later. That only happened because someone stored samples properly. Someone kept chain of custody intact. Someone wrote down details that seemed ordinary. In property rooms and evidence lockers, those decisions can feel routine. But here, you can see their impact. They allowed the case to speak in a new century. As the team continues identifying victims, they also begin the delicate work of notifying families. And each notification has its own rhythm. First, confirmation, then contact, then explanations, then a space for reaction. The language matters. They don't say "we solved it" when there is still a child unnamed. They don't say "we know everything" when they don't. They say "we can tell you what we have learned, and we are still working." For Marlyse Honeychurch's relatives, the identification brings a kind of clarity that sits beside pain. Decades of uncertainty narrow into a concrete truth, and even when truth hurts, it can be easier to carry than endless maybe. For Denise Bourdain's family, the connection to Rasmussen provides answers, but also new questions. Where did Denise go? When did she disappear? What did she experience? And the investigators, careful not to speculate, focus on what they can prove: her last known sighting. The fact that Rasmussen raised her daughter under a false name. The fact that he used aliases and moved often. Each of these facts is like a stone placed in a line. Not the whole bridge, but enough to keep walking. The living person at the center of one branch, the adult Sarah McWatters, also has to make her own peace with a past she never chose, and investigators handle her story with caution. They do not turn her into a spectacle. They treat her as someone who survived a complicated history and who deserves privacy. Meanwhile, the unknown child remains, and in the case notes, you can almost hear the way detectives refer to her, not as an object. In their notes, she becomes a careful phrase, something like "the remaining child" or "the unidentified girl." That wording is deliberate, because language shapes how you think. If you say "unknown," you might start to imagine she can't be found. If you say "unidentified," you remind yourself it's a task, and tasks can be worked, so the team keeps her close, in the middle of the case, not at the edges. They give her a distinct evidence number. They keep her samples stored separately, with extra checks, so nothing gets mixed. They treat every future test as if it might be the one that finally returns her name. And the strange part is, by this point, the case is both famous and unfinished. It's cited in conferences and taught in classes as a landmark in forensic genealogy. It's referenced for what it proved. That time doesn't erase evidence if you protect it. But inside the working file, there's still a blank line where a name should be. The practical work begins with a very simple question. What kind of DNA profile do we have for this child, and what kind do we still need? Older forensic profiles, the short, tandem repeat kind, are good for exact comparisons. The newer genealogical profiles, built from many markers, are better for distant relatives. So detectives and lab partners decide to pursue both routes. because they complement each other. That decision costs time and money, and it also costs patience. A single laboratory step can take months, and then months more if the first run isn't strong enough. Each time results return, someone has to interpret them carefully, not with optimism and not with dread, just with calm attention. When the genealogical profile is ready, it's uploaded to databases that allow this kind of searching. Not every database does. Not every person who tests their DNA agrees to matching that includes law enforcement cases. So it's a limited pool, and that limitation matters. It means the outcome depends in part on strangers making private choices years earlier. At first, the matches that appear are distant, third cousins, fourth cousins, a shared sliver that suggests a connection, but not an immediate one. And the genealogists do not complain about that. A distant match is still a match. It's still a thread, and threads are what you need in a cold case. So you can picture the work that follows, a whiteboard or a software chart filling with names. Great-grandparents, their children, then the children of those children, and so on down to the present day. It's slow because each link must be supported by records. It's also slow because families are complex. People marry, divorce, remarry, move, change their names, and sometimes change their stories. One of the first points of context the team holds on to is geography. The Bear Brook victims were found in New Hampshire. Rasmussen moved through New England and later California. Marlyse's life was traced through California and connections in other states. So genealogists focus their tree building on branches that touch those regions, not because other regions are impossible, but because time and resources are finite. This is one of the quiet disciplines of investigation. You can't chase every possible road. You choose the most likely route, and you walk it carefully, checking for side paths. Then, if it ends, you return and choose again. As the tree grows, investigators keep returning to the same set of questions. Who could this child be, relative to Marlyse Honeychurch? The genetics suggest she shares Marlyse's maternal line, but not as a direct daughter. That points toward a niece relationship, or something similarly close but not immediate. And that matters because it tells you the child may belong to Marlyse's extended family. So the search begins to concentrate around Marlyse's known relatives, siblings, children, cousins in the same generation, then the next generation if needed. And now the work isn't only about charts, it's about real-world verification. You need records. You need, eventually, a living person willing to compare DNA. This is where cold case work becomes quietly interpersonal again. Genealogists can build the most beautiful tree in the world, but at some point someone has to pick up a phone. Someone has to say, "We're working to identify a child, and we believe you may be related." It's a hard call to make, because it changes someone's day and maybe their whole view of their family history. So the team plans those calls with care. They coordinate who should speak and what should be said first. They prepare to answer questions and to accept anger or disbelief or grief. They also prepare to accept silence, because some people don't want to engage. And that boundary has to be respected, even when it slows the investigation. In the background, detectives keep doing a parallel kind of work. They recheck old missing child reports. They focus on the right time window, the late 1970s into the early 1980s. They focus on the right general regions, New England, and places connected to Marlyse's earlier timeline. They also look for reports that may not have been coded well, because older systems sometimes misfiled children under adult categories. They're looking for a report that could match a child who was very young. And that's another hard thing, because young children can disappear without the kind of paper trail adults leave. No job history, no leases, no driver's license. Sometimes, not even school records, if they vanished before school age. They also consider adoption. Adoption can be a kindness, and it can also be a barrier to later identification. Records can be sealed. Names can change. A biological family can lose track of where a child went, even if they never stopped caring. So investigators consult experts in adoption records and in historical record access. They look for legal pathways to request what they need without breaking rules meant to protect living people. And all through this, they keep one guiding principle: do no harm. This is a case with living relatives, living witnesses, and at least one living child who grew up under an alias. So every step is meant to be precise, factual, and compassionate. There's another weird kind of evidence that enters the story here. Not a physical object, not a DNA marker. It's a gap in family knowledge. In some families, there are stories no one tells. A relative who left, and no one knows why. A baby who was mentioned once, then never again. A name that makes the room go quiet. Those gaps can be painful, but in an investigation, they can also be informative. Because when records are scarce, family memory becomes one more kind of map. Investigators begin to hear versions of the same quiet phrase. I've heard something. I was told not to ask. I don't know the details, but there was a situation. These aren't confirmations. They're not proof. But they tell detectives where to look closer and which records might exist under different names. The timeline around Marlyse's last known years also keeps being refined. Detectives work to establish when she was with Rasmussen and where they traveled. They review old addresses that Rasmussen used, including the ones tied to aliases. They look at a trailer park in New Hampshire, where Rasmussen, using the name Bob Evans, lived with Denise Baudin. They look at later locations in California, where he lived with a different partner. They try to build a single, coherent calendar that can hold all of this without bending. And this is where the case reveals another long-term consequence. When someone uses many names, they don't just confuse police. They fracture the memories of communities. Different people know the same man by different labels. Some remember his face, some remember a name, some remember only a voice, or a temper, or the way he repaired something in the yard. So investigators gather those memories and they hold them up against records. Not because memory is perfect, but because memory can point you toward the right drawer in the right courthouse. During this phase, the Bear Brook case becomes a collaboration between kinds of experts who didn't used to sit at the same table: detectives, forensic scientists, genealogists, missing persons specialists, victim advocates, sometimes prosecutors, even if no charges will ever be filed, because the standards of proof still matter. Everyone has a different skill. Everyone also has to speak a shared language, so decisions are consistent. One of the major decisions, as the years move through the late 2010s and early 2020s, is to keep updating the databases. Genealogy databases change as more people test. Law enforcement policies change as companies adjust what they allow. So investigators can't upload once and forget it. They return, again and again, refreshing the search, looking for new matches. A new second cousin can shorten the search by years, and sometimes the updates do produce movement. A match appears that is closer than the earlier ones. Not close enough to hand over a name, but close enough to narrow the branch. Now, instead of building out an entire forest, genealogists can focus on one family line in one county. That's how progress often looks in cold cases. Not a leap, a narrowing. The narrowing leads them to a specific set of relatives connected to Marlyse. And for a while, the working theory becomes simpler. The unidentified child may be the daughter of one of Marlyse's close relatives, a niece. A child who should exist in family memory even if the details were lost. So detectives begin comparing the unknown child's estimated age to births in the Honeychurch family tree. They look for a girl born at the right time. They look for a girl whose later records do not appear. Sometimes those searches create false alarms. A girl who seems to vanish from records until you find her married name. A girl whose birth year is recorded wrong in one document, creating an illusion. A family that moved and the records simply haven't been digitized. Each time the team corrects course, gently. No anger, no drama, just the calm habit of checking. At the same time, detectives keep trying to understand Rasmussen's movements with the children. Because even if you can identify the unknown child through genetics, you still want to know how she came into that situation. Was she taken from a known place? Did she travel voluntarily with adults, in the way very young children do, because adults decide everything for them? Was there an informal custody situation where a child moved between relatives? These questions are hard, and they have to be approached with great care, because speculation can harm living people. So investigators focus on what they can document. Rasmussen lived with Denise Baudin in Manchester, New Hampshire, and then Denise vanished. Rasmussen then appeared elsewhere with Denise's child, calling her his own. Later, he was associated with Marlyse Honeychurch in California. These are facts that can be anchored by records and testimony. Where the unknown child fits into that sequence remains unclear, and that is exactly why her identification matters so much. In the broader Bear Brook story, this ongoing unknown also becomes a reminder about how cases are labeled. People call Bear Brook solved because a suspect has been identified and several victims have names. But investigators don't use that word as easily. They may say the case is cleared by exceptional means because the suspect is deceased. They may say it's substantially resolved. But they keep the file open because one child still needs her own identity returned. And that return isn't symbolic. A name affects everything. A name determines what birth records you can access. A name determines whether a family can claim remains, if they choose. A name determines what can be written on a headstone, or in a family Bible, or in a quiet letter kept in a drawer. So detectives treat the unidentified child not as a footnote, but as the last essential step. As time moves forward, there's another practical decision. Investigators decide to re-examine the physical evidence that might still hold trace information, not in hopes of a dramatic new clue, but because old evidence, when processed with modern methods, can sometimes reveal details that were invisible before. So, they recheck items associated with the barrels. They look again at the barrels themselves. If any portion was preserved in a way that allows testing, they look at adhesives, sealants, paint. They consider whether the drum type could be traced to a supplier. Most of these efforts do not produce a neat answer, and that's expected. Industrial barrels are common. They change hands often. A barrel can be used, reused, sold, traded, scavenged. Still, the team keeps the questions alive because it's possible Rasmussen had a job or contact that made barrels easy to acquire, and every confirmed detail about his work history is one more anchor in the timeline. They also recheck the locations in the park. Even though the barrels were discovered decades ago, the placement still matters. It suggests access points. It suggests confidence. And it suggests perhaps that Rasmussen had been in New Hampshire long enough to know Bear Brook was quiet and to know how to move in and out without attention. So detectives review old maps and old park maintenance logs and old road layouts. They look for changes over time because what is a busy entrance now may have been a lesser used service road then. When you do that kind of work, you begin to understand why cold cases take so long. You aren't only reconstructing human decisions, you're reconstructing the landscape of a past year, the way a road curved before it was widened, the way a lot looked before it was paved, the way a trail connected to an older logging track that no longer exists. All of that becomes context, and context can support the timeline. If you can show that access was easier from a certain direction, you can prioritize which towns Rasmussen may have been passing through, and that can shape which witness memories you decide to seek out again. At some point, someone on the team will revisit the question of Evelyn Colon. Evelyn's disappearance in California is connected to Rasmussen, and it remains unresolved in its own right. It's outside the barrels, but it's inside the pattern, and investigators know that patterns can reveal both motive and opportunity, even if they never become courtroom evidence. So they keep Evelyn's file nearby, cross-referenced, ready. They also review Rasmussen's known relationships, not to judge them, but to understand his methods. He often entered communities under a false name. He sometimes presented himself as stable. He sometimes claimed work that made him sound reliable. Then, when relationships ended, he moved, and those moves became the beats of the timeline, like mile markers on a long road. Back in New Hampshire, detectives focus again on Denise Boudin's disappearance because it remains a missing persons case. Denise has not been located. And even though the Bear Brook barrels suggest likely outcomes, investigators still treat Denise as a person who deserves to be found, if she can be found. They review the last known sighting. They revisit the trailer park environment. They check whether any old tips were never followed, or were followed likely because the case was treated as a voluntary departure. They look at property records, not because they expect to find a dramatic secret, but because property is one place where people sometimes leave traces. In cases like this, it's common for old assumptions to collapse. Maybe a person was assumed to have run away, maybe a person was assumed to have started over. And those assumptions, when they settle in, can slow the urgency of the search. So modern investigators try to correct for that. They read old notes with a gentle skepticism. They ask, if this happened today, would we have treated it differently? Then they try to do, now, what should have been done then. But even with that effort, there are limits. Witnesses age, people move away, a trailer park changes management, and old records are lost. A landlord dies, and the file cabinet is thrown out. So detectives accept that some answers won't come from paperwork. They may only come from DNA and from the patient expansion of databases. And that brings them back again to the unidentified child. The team makes a careful plan. They will continue to upload her profile as databases expand. They will continue to build and rebuild family trees as new matches appear. They will continue to seek out relatives, gently, for confirmatory testing. They will also keep refining the hypothesis of her relationship to Marlyse, because the closer you can define that relationship, the smaller the pool of possible identities becomes. This is where technical detail becomes quietly powerful. Shared centimorgans, the measure genealogists use to describe genetic overlap, can suggest a relationship range. Not an exact answer, but a likely set. And when you combine that with age estimates and with known family structures, you can reduce a wide mystery to a short list. So the team rechecks the numbers and they consult more than one expert. They want consensus, not certainty from a single voice. They also consider the possibility of endogamy. In some communities, family lines interweave and distant cousins share more DNA than expected. That can confuse relationship estimates. So they check for regional patterns and for repeated surnames and for clusters of matches that might indicate a tight-knit community. It's quiet, almost academic work, but it matters, because if the relationship estimate is off by one step, you could search the wrong generation. While all of this unfolds, the case continues to exist in public memory. People visit Bear Brook State Park and think about the barrels. They read about forensic genealogy and imagine a straightforward path from DNA to a name, but in reality, the work is more like pushing a small stone across a table, millimeter by millimeter. Each movement is real. Each movement is slow. At some stage, investigators decide to request additional help, bringing in more genealogical capacity. Not because the existing team failed, because time matters, and attention matters, and a fresh set of eyes can spot a missed record. So more specialists look at the tree. They review the branches already built. They double-check the documentation. They see if any line was assumed rather than proven, and they correct it. This is another quiet virtue of good investigation. You allow yourself to be checked. You allow a colleague to question your link. You keep pride out of it, because the goal is truth, not ownership. And slowly, the work begins to pay off. A new match appears that points more clearly toward Marlyse's side of the family. The match is still not close, but it clusters with earlier ones in a way that strengthens a particular branch. Now the genealogists can say, with more confidence, the unknown child's maternal relatives likely come from this specific family group. That narrows the search dramatically. With that narrowing, detectives prepare for a new wave of outreach. They identify living relatives who might be in the right position to help confirm. They consider who should be approached first, based on family dynamics and on the likelihood the person even knows the relevant history. They prepare letters, because sometimes letters are gentler than calls. They prepare to answer the question everyone asks, sooner or later. How are you connected to my family, and why didn't we know? The answers are never simple. Sometimes the truth is that a family did know and kept it quiet. Sometimes the truth is that a family suspected but could not prove. Sometimes the truth is that a child was born at the edge of a family and paperwork didn't keep up. Sometimes the truth is that a relative moved and a new last name made the trail go cold for decades. So the team does what careful teams do. They turn uncertainty into a checklist of next steps. They decide which relatives to approach first, and which questions to ask, and which records to request. They also decide quietly to expect delays, because people need time to read a letter and sit with it and decide what they can bear. When a relative agrees to help, the process becomes very plain and procedural. A consent form, a simple collection kit, a chain of custody, a laboratory submission. Weeks go by in between because the lab has other cases and because results must be reviewed twice. And in those weeks, the investigators keep working the tree so time isn't wasted. The genealogy teams keep looking for a single, stabilizing confirmation. One match that turns a theory into something you can write down without qualifiers. And then, after enough small steps, the confirmation arrives. The remaining child is identified as a girl named Dawn Ashley. It lands in the case file with a kind of quiet finality. Not because it fixes everything, but because it replaces a blank space with a real name. Dawn is Marlyse Honeychurch's biological daughter, and her identification closes one of the longest open questions in the Bear Brook investigation. Now, all 4 victims from the barrels can be spoken of as individuals. Marlyse Elizabeth Honeychurch, Marie Elizabeth Vaughn, Sarah McWatters, and Dawn Ashley. That doesn't change what happened, but it changes how the world can hold them, with specificity and with respect. With Dawn identified, investigators return to their timeline one more time. They lay out Rasmussen's movements and the known relationships and the places where children lived under changing stories. They confirm, again, what the evidence supports. Rasmussen is tied to the victims through genetics and through the overlapping life histories that led to Bear Brook. But because he died years earlier, there is no courtroom to gather these facts into one official verdict. So the case is resolved in the way some cold cases are resolved, as a careful statement of what is proven. This is where method matters. Detectives document their findings in a way that can be understood later, by families, by courts, by other agencies. They write down which comparisons were made and which labs conducted them, and how each identity was verified. They make sure every conclusion has a footnote, and every footnote has a file. And then comes the softer work, the work that can't be rushed, notifying families, answering questions, listening, and allowing anger and grief to exist without argument. For the Honeychurch family, it means hearing Marlyse's name spoken with certainty after decades. It means learning about Marie and Dawn, and about the years that were stolen from ordinary family memory. For the Vaughn relatives connected to Marie, it means an answer that arrives late, but still matters. It means knowing that the child in old photographs was not lost to history, even if the path was tangled. And for Sarah McWatters, living in the present, it means holding a past that was hidden from her. It means seeing her own identity returned, even if it comes with grief attached to people she never got to meet. Investigators don't ask her to carry the case. They treat her as someone whose consent and comfort have to come first, every time. The Bear Brook case becomes an example, not because it is neat, but because it shows what patience can do. Evidence collected in the 1980s was protected well enough to speak decades later. A barrel in the woods became a long-term record, not just of wrongdoing, but of investigative care. The labels held, The samples remained usable, the notes stayed readable. And then, when technology caught up, the file could finally move. Not through luck, but through the quiet discipline of keeping things in order. There is one more kind of aftermath too, the part where a solved chapter points toward other open ones. Because Bear Brook was never only about Bear Brook. Rasmussen's confirmed identity as a suspect leads investigators back to the other names in his orbit. They recheck old missing persons files, especially cases that involve his known aliases. One of those is the disappearance of Evelyn Colon in California. Her case remains separate, but the overlap is enough to keep detectives from setting it down. They review what is known, the last confirmed sightings, the names used, the addresses, the small paper traces. They compare the time frames again, so the timeline stays honest. And they accept, without dramatizing it, that some questions may never have a final answer, not because no one cares, but because time is a strong eraser. Another lingering question sits even closer to Bear Brook. Denise Baudin, Sarah's mother, remains missing. Investigators have strong reasons to believe Rasmussen is responsible for her disappearance. But belief is not the same thing as location, and her remains have not been found. So the case stays open in that way too. A separate file, cross-referenced, with its own evidence list and its own careful language. The practical work continues, even after the main identifications are complete. Detectives check properties Rasmussen lived at when they can, and they review tips that come in years late. They coordinate with other jurisdictions that may have related files. They keep the DNA records organized so future comparisons can happen quickly. And they keep returning to the basic principle that guided the whole case. Name the victims, then follow their lives, and let the facts do the talking. When you look back over the full arc, the strange evidence is not only the barrels, it's also the way a misidentification held for years, until genetics forced a correction. It's the way an alias, meant to hide a man, later helped unify his records once detectives understood the pattern. It's the way an everyday consumer choice, uploading DNA to learn about ancestry, created a bridge to a missing person's true name. None of that happens quickly. It happens because people stayed willing to revisit old assumptions and willing to do slow work without applause. And if you let yourself picture the case file now, it's thicker than it used to be, but it's also clearer. There are fewer guesswork paragraphs, fewer tentative labels. There are full names, documented relationships, and a timeline that holds together without force. Still, there is no perfect ending in a case like this. There is only the best available truth, assembled carefully and held with humility. The park is still there, Bear Brook State Park, with its trails and its quiet trees and its ordinary weather. People still walk through it without thinking about barrels, and that's not wrong. A park is meant to be a place for breathing, not only for remembering. But somewhere in the background of the investigative world, the case remains a reminder, not of fear, but of time. Time can hide things, and time can also, strangely, reveal them, when evidence has been kept with care. The file is no longer built on absence the way it once was. It holds names now and family lines, and the slow proof of what science can do when it meets persistence. And yet, one line stays open, written in the careful language investigators use when they refuse to pretend. Denise Baudin has not been found. So the work continues in small ways, in quiet ways. A database checked again, a tip reviewed again, a map unfolded again. Not because someone expects a sudden miracle, because you don't close a book while a person's name is still waiting to be brought fully home. For now, though, the case can rest in its current shape. The questions that remain